The Bocage, Normandy, August 1944. The air is thick with the sweet, sickly smell of rotting apples from 1,000 shattered orchards. It is a Normandy perfume, mixed with the acrid stench of diesel exhaust, hot metal, and the coppery tang of fear. The battle for the hedgerows is, according to the planners in London, a grinding success. The beachhead is secure. The breakout is coming. But here, in this labyrinth of ancient earth and tangled roots, the war is not a line on a map. It is a series of short, brutal, 100-yard ambushes. It is a war of attrition, fought by men who have not seen a horizon in weeks. And it is a war against a monster the American doctrine was not built to kill. The ground trembles. Not a rumble, a deep, resonant hum that travels through the soles of a man's boots, up his spine, and settles in the base of his skull. It is a sound that means only one thing. A platoon of M4 Sherman tanks, part of the 2nd Armored Division, inches along a sunken lane. The men inside are not soldiers. They are sacrifices, waiting for their moment. They are farm boys from Ohio and mechanics from Detroit, sealed inside a steel box that was designed for a different war. The commander, a young lieutenant, peers through his periscope. His world a narrow, vibrating slit of green. His knuckles are white where he grips the steel. He is listening. He is waiting for the hum to become a roar. It happens without warning. From a gap in the hedgerow, a place that was empty a second ago, the monster emerges. It is not a tank. It is a fortress. A Panzer V, the Tiger. It is 80 tons of interlocking, sloped Teutonic steel. It moves with a slow, arrogant authority, its massive tracks churning the French soil into mud. Its cannon, the long, elegant, and utterly lethal 88mm gun, swivels with a terrifying hydraulic grace. It does not hunt. It waits. It has chosen its killing ground. The lieutenant screams into his microphone. He shouts, "Target, right flank!" 1 o'clock. Engage. Engage. His gunner is already traversing the turret, the Sherman's 75mm cannon feeling like a toy, a pea shooter. The loader slams a shell into the breech. The gunner fires. The shell is a flash of yellow tracer, a hopeful streak of light that covers the 200 yards in a heartbeat. It strikes the Tiger's frontal plate. It does not penetrate. It does not explode. It ricochets, a screaming, whining firefly disappearing into the Normandy sky. It leaves a small, insulting white scratch on the thick gray paint. The crew of the Tiger does not even register the impact as a threat. Inside the German machine, the commander, a veteran of the Russian front, calmly identifies his targets. He speaks in a low, bored voice to his gunner. He says, "Sherman, left, fire." There is a sound, a sharp, deafening crack, followed by a noise like a giant tearing a sheet of canvas. A thump hiss that travels faster than sound. The lead Sherman in the American platoon does not explode. It ceases to exist. A single armor-piercing shell, the size of a milk bottle and traveling at 3,000 feet per second, punches through the Sherman's thin frontal armor as if it were cardboard. It passes through the driver, turns the engine block into a cloud of shrapnel, and exits through the rear of the tank, leaving a perfectly round, white-hot hole. For a fraction of a second, the tank is just a silhouette. Then, the ammunition and fuel inside ignite in a single catastrophic detonation. The turret, weighing several tons, is blown 30 feet into the air, tumbling end over end before crashing back into the burning husk. The lieutenant watches it happen. He sees the orange-black plume. He smells the burning fuel, the burning men. He has just lost 4 of his soldiers. He screams again. "All tanks, fire on the Tiger. Keep firing." This is the official doctrine. It is called a tank platoon assault. It is a mathematical equation, born of desperation. One Tiger can kill a Sherman from a mile away. A Sherman must close to within a few hundred yards and hit the Tiger's weaker side or rear armor to have any chance. The equation dictates that if 5 Shermans attack one Tiger, 4 will die, but the 5th might get the kill. The men inside the Shermans have a different name for it. They call it the 5-tank sacrifice. Another Sherman fires, another pointless ricochet. The Tiger's gun cracks again. The 3rd tank in the American line shudders to a halt, a plume of thick white smoke pouring from its hatches. The crew bails out, their uniforms on fire. This is the impossible problem. This is the German system of technological superiority, of quality over quantity, made manifest in 80 tons of steel. The official Allied solution is a suicide pact, a grim acceptance that their men and machines are inferior, and that victory can only be bought with a mountain of their own dead. This is the story we think we know. The story of a desperate war of numbers against a handful of superior machines. The story of wonder weapons and the brave, outgunned men who had to face them. But this is not that story. This is the story of a loophole, a story of a fatal systemic flaw hidden in plain sight. It is the story of how the most terrifying and advanced armored force in the world was brought to its knees, not by a bigger gun or a thicker plate of armor, but by the most common, most overlooked, and most mind-numbingly boring resource imaginable. It is the story of how Hitler's steel predators were not defeated. They were starved, and the weapon that starved them was not a bomb or a bazooka. It was a 5-gallon can. This is the story of the one thing the German war machine could build in abundance, but could never, ever get enough of. To understand how the monster was starved, you must first understand its appetite. The entire German theory of modern war, the Blitzkrieg, was not a battle plan. It was a philosophy of motion. It was a symphony of violence, conducted at 30 miles an hour. It was built on the radical idea that speed, shock, and surprise could shatter an enemy's will to fight before he even had time to organize a defense. From the invasion of Poland in 1939 to the stunning 6-week conquest of France in 1940, the panzer divisions were the tip of the spear. They did not engage in battles of attrition. They did not fight for ground. They bypassed strongpoints. They sliced through communication lines. They drove deep into the enemy's rear, creating chaos, panic, and collapse. They were sharks, and like sharks, if they stopped moving, they died. The blood of the Blitzkrieg was not ideology. It was high-octane gasoline. A single panzer division at full strength could consume over 50,000 gallons of fuel in a single day of offensive operations. The new, heavier tanks, the Tigers and the Panthers that so terrorized Allied crews, were even thirstier. A Tiger tank had a 140-gallon fuel tank. On a good road, it might get half a mile to the gallon. In the thick mud and broken terrain of combat, that number plummeted. These were not just war machines, they were fuel-guzzling behemoths, the apex predators of the industrial age, and they had an insatiable, crippling addiction. This was the great, central, and almost universally overlooked problem of the German army. From the very beginning, their entire revolutionary doctrine of armored warfare was built on a resource they did not possess. Germany had almost no natural oil reserves. Every drop of gasoline, every liter of diesel that flowed into the tanks of the Wehrmacht had to be imported from insecure allies like Romania, or created through a fantastically expensive and inefficient process of synthetic fuel production from coal. The German High Command knew this. They saw the fuel gauges as a ticking clock that governed every decision they made. The drive to the Caucasus in 1942 was not a campaign for territory. It was a desperate raid on the Soviet oil fields at Baku. The entire war for Germany was a frantic strategic scramble for fuel. And this is where the institutional arrogance of the Allies became their greatest accidental weapon. The Allied High Command, men like Eisenhower, Montgomery, and the famously aggressive George S. Patton, saw the German panzers as a tactical problem to be solved by other tanks. They were obsessed with the front line. The war was about fighting. It was about closing with and destroying the enemy. The war was about guts. Patton famously declared that to win a war, a soldier needed 3 things: guts, guts, and more guts. He had a deep, visceral contempt for the machinery of supply. The quartermasters, the logisticians, the men he derisively called the bean counters, were a necessary evil. They were the brakes on his glorious headlong charges. His focus was on the spearhead. He and the entire Allied command structure fundamentally saw the war as a fight between tanks. They were locked in a technological and numerical arms race. We need a bigger gun. We need thicker armor. We need to produce 5 Shermans for every 1 Tiger. The established solution was to meet the German system of quality with an American system of overwhelming quantity. This was the failure. They were fighting the monster. They were not fighting its appetite. They saw the Tiger's 88mm cannon as the primary threat, when the real fatal weakness was its fuel pump. The ticking clock was now running faster than ever before. It was the summer of 1944. D-Day had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. The Allies were penned into the claustrophobic confines of the Normandy hedgerow country, bleeding for every field and village. The plan, Operation Cobra, was to use thousands of bombers to blast a hole in the German lines, and then pour the full weight of the American armored divisions, led by Patton's Third Army, through the gap. It was to be Blitzkrieg American style. A race across the open plains of France, aiming to encircle and annihilate the German armies in Normandy, and then drive all the way to the Rhine. But this American blitzkrieg had the exact same requirement as its German predecessor. It needed fuel. Not thousands of gallons, not hundreds of thousands, millions. Millions of gallons of gasoline delivered every single day to the front lines, a front line that would soon be moving at 30 or 40 miles a day. The entire success of the Allied invasion, the liberation of France, the very outcome of the war in Europe, now rested on a vast, unprecedented, and terrifyingly fragile river of gasoline. A logistical operation so immense it dwarfed anything that had ever been attempted in the history of warfare. Two great armies, two philosophies of war, were about to be unleashed in a desperate race across France. Both were addicted to gasoline, but only one of them had a system for delivering it that was as revolutionary and as brutally effective as the tanks themselves. And that system was not the product of a general. It was the legacy of a forgotten German engineer, perfected by a quiet, overlooked innovator from Ohio, a man who saw that the key to modern warfare was not the tank, but the can it was filled from. The monster's designer was not a battlefield commander. He was not a party ideologue nor a grand strategist. His name was Vinzenz Grünvogel, and he was an engineer, a quiet, methodical man from the industrial heartland of Germany, a man obsessed not with conquest, but with the elegant physics of a perfect weld. He was the chief engineer at Mueller & Company, a firm that specialized in sheet metal fabrication. In the mid-1930s, as the new German army was secretly rearming, his department was given a problem, a mind-numbingly boring problem. It was the problem of the fuel can. This was his world, not the roar of engines, but the precise geometry of a spout. Not the trajectory of a shell, but the tensile strength of a handle. He was a man of the factory floor, a man who believed that grand strategy was useless if the smallest, most fundamental components of the machine were flawed. And the German army's fuel can was deeply, profoundly flawed. It was a flimsy, triangular tin, a design that had barely changed since the First World War. It leaked. Its single handle made it awkward to carry. It required a separate wrench to open its cap and a funnel to pour its contents without spilling. It was, to an engineer like Grünvogel, an abomination, an insult to efficiency. This was his unique, on-the-ground eureka moment. He was not looking at the panzers rumbling through the newsreels. He was watching the men who had to service them. He saw soldiers struggling in the mud, fumbling with frozen wrenches, spilling precious, irreplaceable gasoline onto the ground. He saw a bottleneck. He saw the Achilles heel of the entire blitzkrieg concept, and it was a small, leaky piece of stamped tin. He understood, with a clarity that the generals in Berlin did not possess, that the speed of the panzers was ultimately limited by the speed at which a single man could pour 5 gallons of gasoline. He was not asked to create a work of art. He was asked to build a better can. But what he created was a masterpiece of utilitarian design, a weapon in its own right. He started from nothing. He threw out every old assumption. The can had to be strong. So, he made it from 2 halves of pressed steel, fused together with an electric seam weld, a technique that was revolutionary for mass production. He added deep, X-shaped indentations on the sides, not for decoration, but to add rigidity and to allow the fuel inside to expand in the desert heat or high altitude without splitting the seams. It had to be fast, so he designed a revolutionary spout. It had a short, wide mouth, sealed not by a screw cap, but by a hinged cam lever latch that a man could flip open with one hand, even wearing thick gloves. Inside, an integrated air pipe ran from the spout to a small air pocket at the top of the can. This was his genius. As the fuel poured out, air flowed in through the separate pipe, creating a smooth, glugging-free stream. No funnel was needed. No time was wasted. And it had to be easy to handle. This was his most iconic innovation. He designed a triple handle. A soldier could carry a single can in each hand, using the center handle. He could carry 2 empty cans in one hand, using the outer handles. And, most critically, 2 men could form a human chain, passing full cans from a truck to a tank, one after another in a smooth, rapid, and non-fatiguing rhythm. The handles were rounded, not sharp, so they would not cut into a man's hands. The can could float in water, thanks to the air pocket. It could be stacked in perfect, interlocking rows. It was perfect. The Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, the Armed Forces Unit canister, was born. To the men who used it, it was simply the canister. To the Allied soldiers who would soon learn to fear and respect it, it would be known by a different name, the jerry can. While Grünvogel was perfecting his masterpiece, American and British logisticians were content with their own design. A pathetic rectangular tin with 2 screw caps, one for a wrench, one for a funnel. It was made of thin, weak steel, soldered together with a fragile seam that split if the can was dropped or if the contents expanded. It was called the flimsy, and it lived up to its name in every conceivable way. It was a logistical disaster, a product of institutional neglect. While the Germans were designing a system for a fast modern war, the Allies were still thinking in terms of the slow, static battles of the past. Then came the unlikely hero from the other side. His name was Paul Pleiss. He was not a soldier. He was an American engineer, a civilian working in Berlin on a manufacturing contract for the German government. He was a man with an eye for elegant solutions. He was, in every way, uncredentialed. He had no rank, no security clearance, no place in the military command structure. In the summer of 1939, just before the world went mad, Pleiss was preparing for a long road trip back to the United States through Asia. A German colleague, an army officer, was traveling with him. The German military, seeing an opportunity for an intelligence report on road conditions in the region, agreed to provide him with a car and equipment. As part of this equipment, they gave him 3 of their new standard-issue fuel cans. This was Pleiss's eureka moment. It was not a flash of insight in a laboratory. It was a practical, real-world revelation. At some point on that long journey, the car ran low on fuel. The German officer got out. He did not fumble for a wrench or a funnel. He grabbed one of Grunvogel's creations. He flipped the latch, lifted the can, and poured 5 gallons of gasoline into the tank in less than a minute. Pleiss was thunderstruck. He was an engineer. He saw the handles, the spout, the welded seams. He saw not just a can, but a system. He saw a piece of technology that was light years ahead of anything the Allies possessed. He understood instantly its military significance. He knew a mobile army, an army of tanks and trucks, would live or die by its ability to refuel quickly. He was so impressed that when he finished his trip, he did not leave the cans behind. He took them, all 3 of them, to the United States. He drove to the War Department. He found a quartermaster officer. He presented the can. He explained its brilliant design. He showed him how it worked. He argued, with the passion of an evangelist, that the US military had to copy this design immediately. He was dismissed. He was laughed at. He was ignored. The officer he spoke to was a bureaucrat, a man from the established system. He saw a can, a German can. The arrogance of the American industrial machine was absolute. We are the country of Ford, of mass production. We do not copy foreign designs, especially not German ones. The flimsy was their can. It was good enough. The established leadership saw a solution to a problem they did not even recognize existed. Pleiss, the civilian with the strange obsession, was thanked for his time and shown the door. The jerry can was officially rejected. This was the catalyst. September 1st, 1939. The panzers rolled into Poland, their movements fluid, their supply lines stretched thin but holding, sustained by millions of gallons of fuel carried in Grunvogel's perfect can. Then came 1940 and the fall of France. The British Army was thrown off the continent at Dunkirk, leaving behind most of its equipment. The war moved to a new theater, a vast, empty expanse of sand and rock where movement was everything, North Africa. Here, the British 8th Army faced Rommel's Afrika Korps. It was a war of tanks, a war of sweeping maneuvers, and it was a war of logistics. The British were bleeding fuel. The desert sun caused the gasoline in their flimsy tins to expand, splitting the weak seams. Convoys arrived at the front having lost up to 40% of their cargo, not to enemy action, but to leaks. The sand was littered with the dark, telltale stains of wasted fuel. Refueling a tank company was a slow, agonizing process, done under the constant threat of a Stuka attack. The flimsy was not just inefficient, it was a killer. The British, unlike the Americans, were desperate. They had a healthy respect for their enemy's equipment, a respect born of bitter experience. And they began to capture German equipment, including the jerry cans. British officers in the field, the men on the ground, saw the same thing Paul Pleiss had seen. They saw a work of genius. They did not care that it was German. They cared that it worked. This was the unauthorized test. The British did not form a committee. They did not ask for American permission. They were in a fight for survival. They got their hands on a few of Grunvogel's cans, shipped them back to England, and ordered their own factories to make an exact copy. This was the hero breaking the rules. The British system, more pragmatic and less arrogant than the American, simply stole the idea. The new tactic was not a tactic at all. It was a piece of equipment, but one that changed battlefield calculus completely. Picture a squadron of British Crusader tanks deep in the Libyan desert. They have just finished a long approach march. Their fuel gauges are on empty. They are vulnerable, sitting ducks. A supply lorry appears, bouncing over the dunes. Before, this would be the start of a 30-minute ordeal. Men wrestling with stiff, leaky tins, fumbling with wrenches and funnels, spilling fuel, cursing. An open invitation for an enemy reconnaissance plane to spot them. But this lorry is different. It is stacked with the new cans, the British copies of the German design. This is the "it works" moment. The tank crews leap from their vehicles. They form a human chain from the lorry to the tanks. The cans fly from hand to hand, the triple handle design making the work fast and easy. At the tank, a crewman grabs a can, flips the cam latch with a satisfying click, and upends it. A thick, steady stream of gasoline pours into the tank's filler neck. No funnel, no glugging, no spill. A few seconds for 5 gallons. He tosses the empty can aside, grabs the next full one being passed to him. The entire squadron, a dozen tanks, is refueled and ready to move in less than 10 minutes. Just as the last can is being emptied, the radio operator shouts a warning. German armored cars, spotted over the ridge, closing fast. Engines roar to life. The Crusaders, their thirst quenched, pull away from the supply point, just as the first enemy shells begin to fall on the ground where they had been sitting, exposed, only moments before. The test was a stunning success. The stolen idea was genius. The British began to mass-produce the can by the millions. But their great ally, the industrial behemoth that was supposed to be the arsenal of democracy, the nation that would fuel the entire Allied war effort, was still stubbornly, arrogantly committed to the flimsy. The boardroom conflict had not even begun. The American army, preparing for its own war in the desert, was about to learn the hard way that guts and even superior numbers meant nothing when your tanks ran out of gas. The American army that landed in North Africa in November of 1942 was a machine of breathtaking power and profound naivete. It was an army built in Detroit, an army of assembly lines and endless resources, an army that believed in the overwhelming logic of mass production. It rolled ashore in Operation Torch with brand new Sherman tanks, new self-propelled guns, and fleets of new trucks. And every single one of these machines was thirsty. To quench that thirst, the Quartermaster Corps had provided millions of gallons of gasoline, all of it stored and transported in the official, American-designed 5-gallon flimsy. The system was now face-to-face with its enemy, and the enemy was not the German Afrika Korps, it was the physics of the desert. This was the boardroom. It was not a single room, but a mindset, an institutional culture of pride and willful ignorance headquartered in Washington, D.C. It was personified by men in starched uniforms who managed the war with charts and production schedules. One of these men, a senior officer in the Ordnance Department, was the chief defender of the flimsy. He was not a fool, he was a patriot, a man who believed, with every fiber of his being, in the supremacy of American industry. His desk was buried in reports. Reports on steel allocation, on production timelines, on shipping tonnage. To him, the war was a vast problem of industrial output, and America was winning. He had seen the early, condescending reports from British liaisons about their adoption of the captured German canister. He had dismissed them. It was typical British pessimism, he thought, a kind of battlefield fetishism for the enemy's equipment. He saw the flimsy not as a tool, but as a symbol of American ingenuity. It was simple. It was cheap to produce. His factories could stamp out tens of thousands of them a day. He looked at Grunvogel's design, the captured jerry can that men like Pleiss had championed, and he saw everything that was wrong with German engineering. It was over-designed, complicated. The triple handles were a waste of steel. The cam lever latch was a fussy, unnecessary mechanism. The welded seam was more expensive and time-consuming than a simple solder. His argument in meeting after meeting was brutally simple. He said, "Our can holds 5 gallons of gasoline. Their can holds 5 gallons of gasoline. We can make 10 of ours for the price of 4 of theirs. This is a war of production. The case is closed." He saw the pleas from the field as the whining of men who did not understand the big picture. He believed the problem was not the can, it was the soldier. He said, "Our boys just need to be more careful. They need more training and handling procedures." This was the system's response. It was not a technical problem, it was a discipline problem. This was the institutional arrogance, the doctrine of industrial might, made manifest. The general saw the world in a simple binary. More is better. The elegant, robust German design was, to him, stupid. It was inefficient from a production standpoint. And more importantly, it was not American. To adopt it would be an admission of failure, an insult to the engineers and factories of the United States. Back in the deserts of Tunisia, the men on the ground were living in the wreckage of his arrogance. The flimsy was not just failing, it was a catastrophe. The thin steel tins, stacked high in transport ships, were crushed and bent by the motion of the waves. They arrived leaking. On the docks, they were handled roughly by stevedores, and more seams split. They were loaded onto trucks and driven over bone-jarring desert tracks, and with every bump, more cans burst, spraying precious gasoline all over the truck bed. A young supply sergeant with the 1st Armored Division could only watch in horror. His job was to get fuel to the front. He would sign for 100 cans at the rear depot. By the time his trucks made the 50-mile journey to the forward tank companies, he was lucky if he could deliver 60 cans worth of fuel. The other 40 had simply vanished, evaporated into the desert air or soaked into the sand, leaving dark, greasy stains that were a perfect target for any passing Messerschmitt. The act of refueling was a nightmare. The screw caps, made of soft metal, were often cross-threaded or hammered on too tightly at the depot. A soldier needed a wrench to open them. In the heat of the day, the pressure inside the can would cause gasoline to spray into his face as he broke the seal. He would then need to find the separate funnel, which was invariably lost or caked with sand. He would pour, and the flimsy, with no air pipe, would glug and splash, spilling more fuel. It was a slow, dangerous, infuriating process. This was the system's failure, a death by 1,000 tiny leaks. An American tank company, halted to refuel, was a static, vulnerable target for 10 times longer than a British one. And the Americans were fighting alongside the British. The contrast was stark, immediate, and humiliating. A grizzled British tank commander, his Crusader refueled and ready in minutes from his lorry of sturdy olive-drab jerry cans, would watch his American allies struggling, cursing, and spilling their fuel. It was not a source of amusement. It was a source of profound operational concern. The American advance was constantly, inexplicably grinding to a halt, not because of enemy action, but because its tanks were out of gas. This was the gamble. The desperate advocate was not one man, but an entire chorus of enraged field commanders. The reports that flooded back to Washington were no longer suggestions. They were demands. They were written in the language of men who were watching their soldiers die for reasons of bureaucratic pride. They described ambushes that could have been avoided, attacks that had faltered, tanks that had been lost, all because of a pathetic inability to move fuel from point A to point B. One report contained a single devastating photograph. It was a picture of a captured German half-track. Its storage racks were filled with American flimsy tins, picked up from the battlefield. The Germans, the inventors of the perfect fuel can, were so contemptuous of the Allied design that they did not even bother to use them for fuel. They had cut the tops off and were using them to carry sand and store rations. The ultimate insult. The boardroom in Washington was shaken. The general who had championed the flimsy was now facing a tidal wave of evidence. His arguments about production costs seemed insane when measured against the cost in lost tanks and dead men. The war in North Africa was not going well. The green American troops had been mauled by Rommel's veterans at Kasserine Pass. The swift victory they had expected had turned into a bloody, grinding slog. And the central reason for the failure was logistics. It was the fuel. The damn the rules decision was not made by a single hero. It was a slow, agonizing capitulation by an entire system. It was the moment the American military machine was forced to admit that its own design was worthless and that the only solution was to swallow its pride and copy the enemy. An urgent cable was sent from Eisenhower's headquarters to the War Department. It did not request a study. It did not ask for a committee. It was a direct order. It said, cease production of the current 5-gallon can immediately. Retool all available facilities to produce a direct, dimensionally exact copy of the German Wehrmacht Einheitskanister. This was a bombshell. It was a public, humiliating reversal. The officer who had defended the flimsy was now tasked with overseeing its execution. He had to take the very can he had derided as over-engineered and inefficient and turn it into the new American standard. The process was a frantic, reverse-engineered miracle. They did not have Grünvogel's blueprints. They had the cans themselves, captured from the Germans in Tunisia. Engineers in American factories disassembled them, measured every component down to the thousandth of an inch, analyzed the composition of the steel, and replicated the complex welds. They copied the handles, the spout, the air pipe, the latch. They copied everything. The first American-made jerry cans began rolling off the assembly lines in mid-1943. They were a monument to pragmatism over pride, a silent admission that the man on the ground, the soldier in the field, was right, and the experts in their distant offices were wrong. But the clock was ticking. The war in North Africa was won. The invasion of Sicily and Italy was underway. But the real test, the Great Crusade, was still to come. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was being planned. It would be the largest amphibious operation in history, landing hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of vehicles on a hostile shore. And once they were ashore, they would have to fight their way out. The plan for the breakout, for the race across France, for the destruction of the German army in the West, was a plan that would live or die based on a single, boring resource. The entire Allied war effort now depended on the ability of this new, stolen can to quench the insatiable thirst of an army on the move. The gamble had been made. The system had been forced to change. Now, as the landing craft prepared to sail for France, the question was whether they had produced enough of them in time to feed the monster they were about to unleash. The fate of the war now rested on the humble, brilliant, and thoroughly German shoulders of the jerrycan. July 25, 1944, a date that would live in the memory of the German 7th Army as the day the sky fell. Operation Cobra. 3,000 Allied aircraft, bombers, and fighters unleash a biblical cataclysm on a 4-mile stretch of the German front west of St. Lo. They do not just drop bombs, they erase the landscape. They turn fields and villages into a gray, smoking lunar wasteland. They vaporize entire German divisions. And then, through the smoke and the dust, comes the thunder. It is the sound of George S. Patton's Third Army, unleashed from the cage of the Normandy hedgerows. This is not the slow, grinding attrition of the bocage. This is a jailbreak, a stampede. It is blitzkrieg, perfected, amplified, and fueled by the industrial might of the United States. The spearhead is a phalanx of Sherman tanks, no longer timid prey, but predators, racing forward, their engines screaming. They are not waiting for infantry. They are not carefully clearing strongpoints. They are driving. They are moving with a speed and an audacity that shocks even their own commanders. They punch through the pulverized German lines and pour into the open country of France, a torrent of steel and gasoline flooding onto the plains. This is the arrogant advance, but it is not German. It is American. And it is powered by a weapon the German High Command does not understand. It is not a new tank. It is not a bigger gun. It is a river of gasoline, flowing from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. A front line that is now moving 10, then 20, then 40 miles in a single day. And the lifeblood of this river is carried in millions of red blood cells, each one a 5-gallon can of stamped steel. The jerry can has gone to war. The new, unlikely tactic is not a battlefield maneuver. It is a logistical supernova called the Red Ball Express. It is a system born of pure, desperate necessity. The Allied armies are advancing so fast, they have outrun their own supply lines. The railways are destroyed. The ports are in ruins. There is only one way to feed the beast, the roads. So, the High Command makes a radical decision. They designate a vast, one-way circular loop of highways running from the supply dumps near the coast to the armies at the front. It is a closed circuit, reserved for military supply trucks, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All civilian traffic is banned. All other military traffic is banned. It is a highway dedicated to a single purpose, to pump fuel into Patton's tanks. And the men who drive it are the new heroes. They are not frontline combat soldiers. The vast majority are African-American soldiers, men from the Quartermaster Corps, men who had been relegated to the rear echelons, the so-called safe jobs. Now they are the most critical component of the entire Allied war machine. They drive in endless convoys, their 2.5-ton GMC trucks loaded to the breaking point with food, ammunition, and above all, fuel. Jerry cans stacked 10 feet high, strapped down with canvas, a rolling bomb of high-octane gasoline. They drive with the accelerator pressed to the floorboard, 60 miles an hour, their headlights blazing through the night. They are given orders to never stop. If a truck breaks down, they are to pull it to the side of the road and keep going. If a driver falls asleep at the wheel, the man next to him is to take over. They drive for 48 hours straight, powered by coffee, by fear, and by the deafening roar of their engines. Along the route, at designated points, they perform a ballet of violent efficiency. A truck screeches to a halt next to a company of waiting Sherman tanks. The tanks' engines are still idling, their crews streaked with sweat and dust. The drivers leap from their cabs and begin hurling jerry cans to the ground. There is no time for finesse. The cans, Grunvogel's robust, welded creations, bounce on the hard French soil, dented but unbroken. The tank crews, who weeks before had cursed the flimsy, now work with a practiced, desperate speed. They form human chains. The cans fly from hand to hand. A tanker grabs one, flips the latch, and pours the contents into his tank. A smooth, fast, gurgle-free stream of life. In 90 seconds, the tank has swallowed 20 gallons. He tosses the empty can aside, grabs another. Within 15 minutes, the entire company is refueled, rearmed, and roaring back down the road, chasing the horizon, chasing the retreating Germans. The tactic is proven, decisively, in these small, frantic moments, repeated 1,000 times a day, all across the plains of France. The American army has become a shark, and because of the Red Ball Express and the can that made it possible, it never, ever has to stop moving. From inside his Tiger tank, a German panzer commander, a Hauptmann, who had once viewed the Normandy battlefield with the detached arrogance of a god, now sees only chaos. He is in retreat, a word his vocabulary had not included. His perfect machine, the apex predator of the hedgerows, is now a refugee, fleeing a tidal wave. The radio in his headphones is a cacophony of panic. He hears reports that are impossible. An American armored column spotted near Avranches, but that is 50 miles south. It cannot be. He hears that another column has taken Rennes. He looks at his map. He sees the neat, orderly lines of his own front, and he sees the thick red arrows of the American advance, arrows that are not crawling but leaping across the countryside. His own fuel gauge is his most immediate enemy. He started the day with a full tank. He has spent most of it on the road, not fighting, but running, trying to get to a new defensive line that no longer exists. Now, the needle is hovering over the red. He is ordered to form a blocking position to counterattack a fresh American breakthrough. He looks at his platoon of 4 Tigers. They are the most powerful armored force on this section of the front. Together, they can destroy 50 Shermans, but they can only move for another 10 kilometers. He radios his supply officer. He asks, he demands, for fuel. The answer is a crackle of static and despair. The fuel depot was overrun an hour ago. The nearest supply column is 50 miles to the east and is being strafed into oblivion by P-47 Thunderbolts. There is no fuel. This is the enemy's bafflement. This is the panic. The Hauptmann, a master of tank tactics, a man who knows the armor thickness and muzzle velocity of every tank on the battlefield, is being defeated by an enemy he cannot see. He is being defeated by logistics. His perfect system, his 88mm gun and his 100mm of frontal armor, is being dismantled by an impossible enemy. An enemy that moves without sleeping. An enemy that seems to drink gasoline from the very air. His own system is collapsing. The German army, the pioneer of the Blitzkrieg, is now paralyzed, roadbound, and thirsty. The French civilians, who had once feared them, now stand by the side of the road and mock them. Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, own the daytime sky. They circle like vultures, hunting for the slow, lumbering convoys, the soft-skinned fuel trucks that are the German army's only hope. Every burning Opel Blitz on the side of the road is another nail in the coffin of the 7th Army. The climax of this logistical war is not a single battle. It is an encirclement, a place that will become a synonym for hell, the Falaise Pocket. Patton's 3rd Army, instead of driving east towards Paris, performs a maneuver of breathtaking audacity. He wheels his entire army south and then hooks north, racing to close the only escape route for the entire German force in Normandy. The German High Command, including Field Marshal von Kluge, watches this happen on their maps, and they do not believe it. They are professional soldiers. They understand the laws of supply and demand. An armored corps cannot make a 200-mile flanking march without a massive pause and refit period. It is a logistical impossibility. They project that Patton will run out of fuel somewhere around Le Mans. They base their entire strategy, their entire hope of an orderly withdrawal on this single fundamental assumption. They assume the Americans are bound by the same rules of physics that govern them. They are wrong. Patton does not stop at Le Mans. He does not even slow down. The Red Ball Express, that pulsing artery of trucks and jerrycans, stretches and flexes, and it keeps the fuel flowing. The Shermans keep rolling. The jaws of the trap begin to close. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles, are caught. They are squeezed into a shrinking pocket, a cauldron of death between the towns of Trun, Argenton, and Chambois. What happens next is not a battle. It is an annihilation. The pocket becomes a slaughterhouse. Allied artillery, massed hub to hub, rains down an ceaseless storm of high explosives. Fighter bombers roam at will, strafing anything that moves. And the roads, the escape routes, become a vision from a nightmare. They are choked with the wreckage of the German army. But a reconnaissance pilot, flying low over the scene, would notice something strange. He would see hundreds of tanks, of armored personnel carriers, of trucks that are not burning. They are not riddled with shell holes. They are simply stopped. They are parked at odd angles, some of them pulled neatly to the side of the road, as if their drivers had simply stepped out for a moment. A mighty King Tiger, the most feared tank of the war, sits with its massive cannon pointed uselessly at the sky, abandoned. A column of Panzer IVs is frozen in place, a perfect stationary target. These are the monuments to the victory of the jerrycan. They are machines that ran out of gas. Their crews, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, had set demolition charges or had simply walked away, trying to escape the carnage on foot. They were defeated not by a shell, but by a simple, boring, and absolute lack of fuel. This is the title validation. Hitler's superior tanks were now nothing more than 80 tons of useless steel. They were coffins, abandoned on the road to ruin because their masters had built a war machine whose thirst they could never quench. An American infantryman, a young private from the 90th Division, helping to close the pocket, walks down one of these roads. The air is thick with the stench of death, a foul mix of cordite, rotting horses, and decaying men. He walks past the burned-out hulks, the twisted metal, and then he sees it. A Panther tank, sleek, sloped, and menacing even in death. It is completely undamaged. Its paint is not even scratched. It looks like it just rolled off the factory floor. He cautiously approaches it, his rifle ready. He peeks inside. It is empty. The crew is gone. On the floor of the turret is a map, a half-eaten piece of bread, and a single, empty, German-made jerry can, the can that had started it all. The private, a boy who a few weeks ago was terrified of these machines, now understands. He does not need a general to explain the strategy to him. He can see it. This technological monster, this beast that had terrorized his friends, had died of thirst. The war was not just about guts, it was about gas. And his side, thanks to a stolen idea and an army of tireless truck drivers, had it in rivers. The other side had it in drops, and that had made all the difference. In the Wolfschanze, the wolf's lair, in the damp forests of East Prussia, the maps told a story of utter catastrophe. The men of the German High Command, men who had redrawn the borders of Europe with the stroke of a grease pencil, now stared at the collapsing front in France with a cold, hollow dread. The after-action reports from the field were a litany of excuses and accusations. They blamed Hitler's insane stand-fast orders. They blamed the overwhelming, criminal superiority of Allied air power. They blamed the treachery of the French resistance. They blamed everything except the one, simple, humiliating truth that stared back at them from the pages of their own logistical summaries. The truth was written in liters. A panzer division requesting 50,000 liters of petrol and receiving 5,000. A Tiger battalion, the pride of the SS, reporting all tanks combat-ready but immobile. A counterattack, ordered, then cancelled, then ordered again, not because of enemy action, but because the fuel trucks had been strafed into burning pyres on the road from Rouen. Their reaction was not one of tactical reappraisal, it was one of profound professional shame. They were the architects of Blitzkrieg, they had written the book on modern mechanized warfare, and they were now watching their armies being encircled and annihilated by a crude American imitation of their own doctrine, an imitation that worked with a brutal efficiency that defied their understanding. An emergency countermeasure was issued, a frantic, pathetic gesture. An order went out to prioritize the production of wood gas generators for trucks, a primitive, wheezing technology that belonged in the previous century. They began to strip divisions of their remaining transport and reissue horses. The war machine that had conquered a continent on a wave of high-octane gasoline was now reverting to the speed of muscle and hay. The bafflement was absolute. How were the Americans doing it? How were their tank columns covering 70 miles a day for weeks on end? The German intelligence officers studying reconnaissance photos saw the answer. They saw the endless convoys of the Red Ball Express. They saw the dumps, the colossal pyramids of 5-gallon cans lining the French highways. And they recognized the can. It was theirs. It was the Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, their perfect, patented, brilliantly German invention, now painted with a white American star. The Allies had not just copied their tactics, they had stolen their masterpiece of logistics and had turned it into a weapon of mass supply. The masters of the machine age had been defeated by better plumbing. Their entire system, built on the perfection of the Tiger's gun, had been dismantled by the perfection of their own fuel can. And what of the men who created this story? Vincent Grunvogel, the quiet engineer from Schwelm, the man who bent steel into a work of art, survived the war. His factory, Mueller & Company, lay in the British occupation zone, a heap of rubble like so much of Germany. He did what engineers do. He went back to work. He helped rebuild. He designed new things, new pieces of sheet metal for a new, peaceful world. He received no medal, no national acclaim. His name was never chiseled onto a war memorial. His creation, the Kanistar, was a symbol of a war he and his country wanted to forget. He was a ghost, an anonymous father to one of the most successful and influential designs of the 20th century. He lived out his days in quiet obscurity, a man who had solved a simple problem so perfectly that he had, by accident, handed his country's enemies the key to their defeat. He died in 1977. His legacy strapped to the sides of military vehicles in every corner of the world. His name known to almost no one. Paul Pleiss, the American visionary who had tried to sound the alarm, also returned to his quiet life. He went back to his engineering work, his brief, frustrating crusade in the halls of the War Department, a fading, almost unbelievable memory. He had watched the war unfold, had seen the newsreels of Patton's Shermans racing across France, and had surely felt a profound private vindication. He had seen the future in a simple piece of German steel, and the future had proven him right. He never wrote a book. He was never interviewed for a documentary. He was just a man who had paid attention, a man who understood that a war of machines is a war of maintenance, and that a small, elegant solution is always superior to a large, clumsy problem. His reward was not fame or fortune. His reward was the knowledge that the system, in its lumbering, arrogant way, had eventually, and just in time, been forced to admit that he had been right. The uncredentialed outsider had seen the truth that the credentialed experts had missed. The moral of this story is not subtle. It is the great, ironclad, and often ignored law of modern conflict. Amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. War is a spectacle of violence, and we are drawn to the spectacle. We are mesmerized by the Tiger tank, by its thick armor and its lethal gun. It is a symbol of power, of technological terror. It is the star of the show. We are conditioned to believe that wars are won by the side with the superior weapon, with the bravest soldiers, with the most brilliant general. This is a comforting, dramatic lie. The truth is far more boring and far more profound. The Tiger was a tactical masterpiece and a strategic catastrophe. It was a weapon so complex, so fuel-hungry, so difficult to maintain that it was a liability to the very army it was supposed to lead. It won battles, and in doing so, it helped to lose the war. The real war, the war that determined the fate of nations in 1944, was not fought by the tankers. It was fought by the men of the Red Ball Express, driving themselves to the point of collapse in the cab of a GMC truck. It was fought by the nameless quartermasters in their muddy depots, counting cans and signing forms. It was fought by the stevedores on the beaches and the engineers who had copied a German design. It was a war of inventory, of supply chains, of fuel dumps. It was a war won by the bean counters whom Patton so despised. Guts are useless when the fuel tank is empty. A brilliant plan is just a piece of paper if you cannot get the ammunition to the guns. The German army in France was a magnificent, thoroughbred racehorse that had been trained to perfection for the sprint and then asked to run a marathon. It died of exhaustion, of thirst, of starvation. The Allied army was a stubborn, ugly mule, but it was a mule with an endless supply of oats and water. And in a war of attrition, the mule will always, always outlast the racehorse. This is the full circle, the final, quiet victory of Grunvogel's design and Pleiss' foresight. Travel to any corner of the modern world where soldiers operate. Go to the dusty deserts of the Middle East, the frozen plains of Eastern Europe, the humid jungles of Asia. Look at the machines of war. A British Challenger tank, an Israeli Merkava, a Russian T-90. Look at the American Humvees, the French troop carriers, the Chinese supply trucks. You will see it. Strapped to the hull, tucked into a storage rack, stacked in the back of a lorry. It is the can. It might be made of high-impact plastic now. It might be painted a digital camouflage pattern. It might have a slightly different latch mechanism. But the design is eternal. The shape is the same. The triple handle is there. The quick pouring spout with its integrated air pipe is there. It is the Wehrmacht Einheits canister, a ghost from the 1930s, still serving on the front lines of the 21st century. The unauthorized idea, the stolen design, that the US Ordnance Department had once dismissed as foreign, complicated, and stupid, is now the NATO standard. It is the global standard. It is so ubiquitous, so fundamental to the simple act of moving fuel, that its origins have been completely forgotten. It is no longer a jerry can. It is just a fuel can. The copy has become the original. And perhaps the greatest irony of all can be found in a modern German army motor pool. There, a soldier of the Bundeswehr, the army of a democratic, unified Germany, will prepare his Leopard 2 tank for a training exercise. He will check the engine, the tracks, the gun. And when he needs to top off the auxiliary fuel tank, he will walk to a supply shed. He will pick up a can. It will be olive drab or desert tan. It will have 3 handles. He will carry it to his tank, flip the cam lever latch, and pour. He will be using the exact same piece of brilliant utilitarian design that his grandfather used in a Panzer IV on the plains of Russia. A design so perfect, so timeless, that it has outlasted the evil ideology it was built to serve. The most terrifying weapons of the Second World War now sit silent in museums, relics of a bygone era. But the humble jerry can, the boring, overlooked, and utterly essential tool that fueled the armies of the world, is still at work. A quiet, rectangular monument to the simple, brutal truth that the most powerful weapon in any army's arsenal is its ability to get a boring resource from a safe place to a dangerous one. It is a lesson written in spilled gasoline and abandoned tanks, a lesson that cost 1 million lives to learn. The most advanced tank in the world is just a tombstone when it runs out of gas.